Mrs. Chen never thought she'd end up renting her spare room to an alien. Yet here she was, standing in her kitchen on a quiet Sunday morning, watching her new tenant struggle with a coffee mug while muttering about the inefficiency of human appendages. The whole situation had started 3 weeks ago when a perfectly normal-looking advertisement for her spare room attracted a rather unusual applicant. The young woman who showed up at her doorstep seemed ordinary enough at first glance: shoulder-length dark hair, business casual attire, and a polite smile. But there was something just slightly off about her movements, as if she was still learning how to operate her own body. "I am interested in studying human domestic habits," the woman had said, her voice carrying an odd lilt that Mrs. Chen initially attributed to a foreign accent. "Your advertisement mentioned that you prefer quiet tenants who keep to themselves. I assure you, I am here purely for observational purposes." Looking back, Mrs. Chen should have picked up on the peculiar phrasing. But after 6 months of dealing with questionable applicants and late rent payments from her previous tenant, she was just relieved to meet someone who seemed clean, quiet, and came with 3 months' rent in advance. It wasn't until the second week that Mrs. Chen began noticing the truly bizarre things. Her new tenant, who called herself Lin, would stare in fascination at the most mundane objects, like the dish soap bubbles or the way steam rose from hot coffee. She took copious notes about everything, from how long it took for bread to toast to the curious human ritual of sorting laundry by colors. This morning, however, marked the first time Lin had openly expressed her confusion about human features. Mrs. Chen had walked into the kitchen to find her tenant holding a coffee mug at arm's length, examining her own fingers with an expression of bewilderment. "Mrs. Chen," Lin said, turning to face her landlady with genuine confusion, "why do humans have such inefficient appendages? These fingers, they're so limited in their range of motion. And why only 5? Surely at least 8 would be more practical for manipulating objects?" Mrs. Chen nearly dropped her own coffee mug. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" Lin blinked those peculiarly bright eyes of hers. Had they always had that slight purple tinge? "Oh. My apologies. I sometimes forget to maintain the expected social protocols. Please pretend you didn't hear that observation about human biological limitations." But Mrs. Chen wasn't about to let this slide. Setting her mug down carefully, she pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down. "Lin, is there something you'd like to tell me?" The young woman, or whatever she was, seemed to deflate slightly. Her perfect posture slouched, and for a moment, Mrs. Chen could have sworn her skin shimmed with a faint iridescent quality. "I suppose I haven't been as subtle as my research protocols demanded," Lin admitted, her voice losing its carefully practiced human inflections. "You're not from around here, are you?" Mrs. Chen asked, surprising herself with how calm she felt. After 40 years of running a boarding house in the city, she'd seen all sorts of interesting characters. An alien might actually be less troublesome than some of her previous tenants. "If by here you mean Earth, then no," Lin replied, looking somewhat relieved to drop the pretense. "I'm part of an anthropological research team studying human domestic behaviors. We find your species fascinating, particularly your ability to thrive despite numerous biological inefficiencies." Mrs. Chen couldn't help but chuckle. "Inefficiencies? Like what?" Lin's eyes lit up, literally, with a subtle purple glow. "Oh. Well, for instance, your sleeping patterns are remarkably wasteful. Nearly 1/3 of your life spent unconscious. And your digestion system? The number of times humans need to consume and process nutrients is quite excessive. Not to mention your limited sensory capabilities." As Lin launched into an enthusiastic critique of human biology, Mrs. Chen found herself growing more amused than alarmed. Here was an advanced being from another world, and her biggest complaint was that humans needed too many bathroom breaks. "Would you like some breakfast?" Mrs. Chen interrupted Lin's detailed analysis of why human teeth were poorly designed. "I'm making congee, and you can tell me more about why you think our eyesight is subpar." Lynn's face brightened. Oh yes, please. Your cooking has been a fascinating aspect of my research. Though I still don't understand why you insist on adding what you call love to your recipes. I've been unable to detect this ingredient with any of my scanning equipment. Mrs. Chen laughed as she started preparing the rice porridge. Some things about humans might be beyond your scientific instruments, Lynn. As they shared breakfast, Mrs. Chen learned more about her unusual tenant. Lynn's species had been observing Earth for centuries, sending researchers to live among humans and study their daily lives. Most aliens preferred to observe from a distance, but Lynn had volunteered for immersive research, believing that the best way to understand humans was to live as one. Though I must admit, Lynn confessed, carefully spooning up congee, I didn't expect it to be quite so challenging. Your bodies have so many maintenance requirements. And don't even get me started on your circadian rhythms. Mrs. Chen smiled knowingly. Yet here you are, eating congee and drinking coffee like a proper human. The coffee is purely for research purposes, Lynn insisted, taking another sip. Though I must admit, the chemical stimulant effects are quite pleasant. We have nothing like this back home. Most of our sustenance comes from directly absorbing energy through our natural photosynthesis process. As the morning went on, Mrs. Chen found herself thinking that perhaps having an alien tenant wasn't so strange after all. In fact, it might be the most interesting thing to happen to her since she started renting out rooms 30 years ago. Besides, Lynn paid her rent on time, kept her space tidy, and seemed genuinely fascinated by human culture, even if she did occasionally forget to maintain her human appearance when she got too excited. You know, Mrs. Chen said as she cleared away their breakfast dishes, if you really want to understand humans, you might need to stop analyzing everything so scientifically. Sometimes the most important things about us can't be measured or quantified. Lynn tilted her head, her notepad hovering forgotten in her hand. What do you mean? Well, take this morning for example. We shared a meal, had a good conversation, and learned something new about each other. That's a very human experience, but you won't find its value in any scientific analysis. For the first time since revealing her true nature, Lynn looked genuinely puzzled. But how do you measure the success of such an interaction without proper metrics? Mrs. Chen smiled warmly. You don't measure it, dear. You feel it. This concept seemed to both confuse and intrigue Lynn, who immediately pulled out her notepad to record this new information. As Mrs. Chen watched her alien tenant scribbling away, she couldn't help but wonder what other surprises this unusual living arrangement might bring. One thing was certain, life with an alien roommate was going to be anything but boring. The weekend following Lynn's revelation brought an entirely new set of adventures that Mrs. Chen hadn't quite prepared for. It started with a simple suggestion to go grocery shopping together, but like everything involving her alien tenant, it turned into something far more memorable. You humans have designated buildings just for acquiring sustenance? Lynn's eyes sparkled with that now familiar purple gleam as they entered the local supermarket. And you come here, regularly? Mrs. Chen adjusted her shopping bag, trying not to laugh at Lynn's barely contained excitement. Yes, usually once a week. Though I'm beginning to think I should have prepared you better for this. Lynn was already striding ahead, her normally perfect posture forgotten as she darted from aisle to aisle. Look at this. You organize your sustenance by temperature requirements. And these. She picked up a bunch of bananas, turning them over in her hands. You actually consume items that come in their own biodegradable packaging? Fascinating. The weekend following Lynn's revelation brought an entirely new set of adventures that Mrs. Chen hadn't quite prepared for. It started with a simple suggestion to go grocery shopping together, but like everything involving her alien tenant, it turned into something far more memorable. You humans have designated buildings just for acquiring sustenance? Lynn's eyes sparkled with that now familiar purple gleam as they entered the local supermarket. And you come here, regularly? Mrs. Chen adjusted her shopping bag, trying not to laugh at Lin's barely contained excitement. Yes, usually once a week. Though I'm beginning to think I should have prepared you better for this. Lin was already striding ahead, her normally perfect posture forgotten as she darted from aisle to aisle. Look at this. You organize your sustenance by temperature requirements. And these. She picked up a bunch of bananas, turning them over in her hands. You actually consume items that come in their own biodegradable packaging? Fascinating. Keep your voice down, Mrs. Chen whispered, noticing a few curious glances from other shoppers. Remember what we discussed about blending in? Oh, right. Lin straightened up immediately, adopting what she probably thought was a casual human stance. Unfortunately, she looked more like a mannequin trying to appear relaxed. I shall contain my scientific enthusiasm and proceed with normal human shopping behaviors. The produce section proved to be particularly challenging. Lin couldn't understand why humans would willingly eat something as defensively armed as a pineapple, and she spent 10 minutes documenting the remarkable color-changing properties of ripening avocados. When they reached the spice aisle, Mrs. Chen thought her tenant might short-circuit from sensory overload. Your species deliberately adds irritants to your food to enhance flavor? Lin's voice was a mixture of horror and admiration as she examined a bottle of hot sauce. And this one, it's rated at 50,000 Scoville units? You voluntarily consume this? Mrs. Chen gently took the hot sauce from Lin's trembling hands. Some humans enjoy the sensation. It's like an adventure for your taste buds. An adventure that causes pain, Lin muttered, making another note in her ever-present notebook. Humans seek out voluntary discomfort for pleasure. Adding this to my growing list of paradoxical behaviors. The real entertainment began when they reached the snack aisle. Lin became absolutely fascinated by potato chips, particularly the concept of different flavors. You take a naturally occurring food item, slice it incredibly thin, apply heat and sodium, and then coat it with synthetic flavoring designed to mimic other foods? And people prefer this over the original potato? Well, when you put it that way. Mrs. Chen couldn't help but see how bizarre it all seemed from an outsider's perspective. The shopping trip took 3 times longer than usual, with Lin insisting on examining every new item she encountered. The frozen food section nearly caused a meltdown, literally. Lin's excitement over the concept of flash frozen meals caused her human disguise to flicker briefly, her skin taking on a distinct metallic sheen that fortunately only Mrs. Chen noticed. Your preservation methods are remarkably primitive yet ingenious, Lin declared while studying a frozen pizza. Though I must question the logic of freezing perfectly good food only to apply heat to it later. Wouldn't it be more efficient to consume it immediately after production? Sometimes convenience is more important than efficiency, Mrs. Chen explained patiently. Humans often need to balance multiple priorities. This concept seemed to trouble Lin deeply. She spent the next 15 minutes muttering about illogical time management, while scanning various frozen dinners with what appeared to be an invisible device hidden in her sleeve. The cooking lesson with Lin had gone surprisingly well, despite a few minor incidents involving the microwave and an overly enthusiastic attempt to optimize Mrs. Chen's rice cooker. But now, they faced an even greater challenge. Mrs. Chen's weekly mahjong gathering was approaching, and Lin was determined to study what she called human recreational social bonding rituals up close. Are you absolutely sure about this? Mrs. Chen asked, watching Lin practice holding tea cups without accidentally scanning them for molecular composition. My friends can be quite particular. I have extensively studied human social interactions, Lin assured her, though the slight flicker of purple in her eyes betrayed her nervousness. I've even mastered several common conversation topics, weather patterns, local sports team statistics, and complaints about public transportation. Mrs. Chen sighed. Just remember, no scanning anyone, no taking notes, and please, try not to mention anything about human biological inefficiencies. The first guest to arrive was old Mrs. Wu from 2 streets over, carrying her famous pineapple cakes and a lifetime of neighborhood gossip. Lin immediately put her research into practice. The atmospheric conditions today are approximately 3.2 degrees warmer than yesterday, she announced proudly as Mrs. Wu entered. This may indicate a shifting weather pattern consistent with typical seasonal variations. Mrs. Wu blinked. My arthritis could have told you that, dear. Before Lin could launch into her prepared analysis of human joint deterioration, the doorbell rang again. Mrs. Li and Mrs. Zhang arrived together, already deep in discussion about Mrs. Li's grandson's recent wedding. The ceremony was beautiful, Mrs. Li was saying, though the bride insisted on some very modern touches. In my day, we didn't need all these fancy decorations. Lin perked up. Ah yes, human pair bonding ceremonies. A fascinating evolution of tribal customs meant to ensure genetic diversity and social stability within communal groups. 3 pairs of eyes turned to stare at her. She's an anthropology student, Mrs. Chen quickly intervened. Doing research on cultural traditions. Oh, how lovely. Mrs. Wu brightened. My niece studied anthropology. Though she ended up opening a bubble tea shop instead. Speaking of which, did you hear about the new shop opening near the park? As the conversation shifted to safer topics, Lin sat quietly, observing the intricate social dynamics playing out before her. She watched in fascination as the women seamlessly wove together multiple conversation threads, moving from gossip to complaints about rising prices to proud updates about their grandchildren. The real challenge began when they started playing mahjong. Lin had downloaded and processed the complete rules of the game, but she quickly discovered that human players didn't always follow strict logical patterns. But according to optimal strategy, that tile should have been discarded 3 turns ago, she protested when Mrs. Li made what appeared to be an illogical play. Mrs. Li smiled mysteriously. Sometimes you have to follow your gut, dear. Your digestive system influences game decisions? Lin whispered to Mrs. Chen, genuinely confused. The afternoon took an unexpected turn when Mrs. Wu started sharing stories about her youth. Lin found herself completely captivated by tales of love letters hidden in mooncakes, secret meetings in tea houses, and family dramas that span generations. But how did you know your husband was the right match without conducting a thorough compatibility analysis? Lin asked, momentarily forgetting her cover. Mrs. Wu chuckled. Oh, sweetie. Sometimes the heart knows things that the head can't understand. This concept seemed to short-circuit something in Lin's processing. She spent the next few rounds of mahjong muttering quietly about inefficient decision-making processes and the illogical influence of emotional variables. The situation became more complicated and Mrs. Zhang started showing off pictures of her new great-granddaughter on her phone. Lin became so excited about analyzing human infant development stages that she accidentally made her teacup float. Fortunately, Mrs. Li was too busy arguing about a discarded tile to notice, and Mrs. Wu had removed her glasses to clean them at that exact moment. Only Mrs. Chen saw her alien tenant hastily grabbing the cup from midair. Perhaps you've had enough tea, she suggested quietly. As the afternoon wore on, Lin's rigid posture gradually relaxed. She found herself drawn into the rhythm of the game, the flow of conversation, and the warm atmosphere of friendship that filled the room. She even caught herself laughing, genuinely laughing, not just mimicking the sound, at Mrs. Zhang's story about her grandson's disastrous attempt at making traditional mooncakes. When the guests finally started gathering their things to leave, Lin made an interesting observation. Mrs. Chen, she whispered, helping to clear away the tea cups, I've noticed something peculiar. These women have been friends for many years, correct? Nearly 4 decades. And yet they spent approximately 47.3% of the afternoon engaging in what appears to be mild criticism of each other's families, life choices, and gaming strategies. According to my research, this should indicate social conflict, but they seem closer because of it? Mrs. Chen smiled. That's what we call friendship, dear. Sometimes the closest friends are the ones you can complain to, and about. Lin's face scrunched in concentration. So, criticism can be a form of affection? Humans are deliberately inefficient in their communication methods to demonstrate emotional bonds? Something like that. Later that evening, after everything was cleaned up, Lin sat in the kitchen making notes while Mrs. Chen prepared dinner. The alien researcher had been unusually quiet since their guests left. Is everything all right? Mrs. Chen asked. You seem troubled. Lin looked up from her notes, her expression puzzled. I'm experiencing an unexpected response to today's events. I find myself missing our guests, despite the fact that their presence was primarily for research purposes. Is this normal? Mrs. Chen hid a smile. Perfectly normal. Some might even say it's a very human reaction. Oh dear. Lin's eyes widened in alarm. Do you think my immersion research is affecting my neural patterns? Should I contact my superior for recalibration? Or maybe, Mrs. Chen suggested gently, you're just learning that there's more to being human than can be measured and analyzed. Lin considered this for a long moment. Perhaps, she finally admitted, some inefficiencies serve a purpose I hadn't previously considered. As they sat down to dinner, Mrs. Chen noticed that Lin had stopped taking notes. Instead, her alien tenant seemed content to simply experience the moment, inefficiencies and all. It was, Mrs. Chen thought, probably the most human thing she'd done yet. The day started normally enough, or as normal as things could be with an alien researcher living under your roof. Mrs. Chen was enjoying her morning tea when she heard a strange buzzing sound coming from Lin's room, followed by what sounded suspiciously like electronic chirping. Lin, she called out, knocking on the door. Is everything all right in there? The door opened to reveal a scene that made Mrs. Chen question whether she should have had something stronger than tea for breakfast. Lin's room, usually pristinely organized, looked like a tech shop had exploded inside it. Every electronic device from the house appeared to be floating in mid-air, surrounded by soft purple light. Ah, good morning. Lin chirped cheerfully, her human disguise flickering slightly as she manipulated what appeared to be Mrs. Chen's old microwave. I hope you don't mind, but I noticed your household technologies were operating at suboptimal efficiency levels. I thought I could help upgrade them while submitting my weekly report to my superiors. Mrs. Chen stared at her toaster, which was now hovering near the ceiling and emitting a faint humming sound. Lin, what exactly are you doing to my appliances? Simple improvements. Lin's eyes glowed with enthusiasm. For instance, your toaster can now analyze the molecular structure of bread to achieve the perfect level of caramelization. And your microwave? It's currently being recalibrated to heat food at the atomic level for maximum flavor retention. Oh, and your rice cooker can now generate its own microclimate for optimal grain hydration. Before Mrs. Chen could respond, her smartphone floated past, its screen flashing with symbols she'd never seen before. And what's happening to my phone? Just a minor upgrade to connect it to the Universal Data Network. Though I had to be careful not to give it too much access, we don't want another incident like the one that happened in your Earth year 1947 when a researcher accidentally gave a primitive calculator access to quantum computing. Mrs. Chen decided she didn't want to know about that incident. Lin, remember what we discussed about maintaining low profile? Oh, yes. Lin looked slightly embarrassed. But I made sure to maintain appropriate technological limitations. Your devices won't exceed Earth's current capabilities by more than, well, perhaps a few decades. Just then, the toaster made a sound that seemed impossibly close to a purr. Mrs. Chen watched in astonishment as it gently floated down and settled on the desk, now sporting what appeared to be a small touch screen. Would you like to try it? Lin asked eagerly. I've programmed it with 347 different toast settings, including one that can recreate the exact browning pattern of any image you upload. Before Mrs. Chen could answer, her phone started playing what sounded like a symphony composed entirely of electronic beeps and whirs. That would be my superior calling, Lynn explained, plucking the floating phone from the air. They're probably wondering why I'm accessing the quantum network from a Earth device. Don't worry, I'll explain everything. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Mrs. Chen had ever heard, a mixture of musical tones, static, and what sounded like a dial-up modem having an existential crisis. Lynn's human disguise flickered more noticeably as she gestured animatedly, occasionally pointing to the various floating appliances. No, I haven't exceeded protocol parameters, Lynn insisted in English, apparently forgetting to maintain her normal speaking pattern. The modifications are well within acceptable limits for a Class 3 developing civilization. Yes, I know about the toaster incident in Belgium, but I've taken precautions. No, the humans won't notice anything unusual, I've maintained appropriate technological camouflage. Mrs. Chen cleared her throat. Lynn, the microwave is changing colors. Indeed, the floating microwave was cycling through a rainbow of metallic hues, each accompanied by a different musical note. Lynn quickly waved a hand, and it settled back to its original white color. Minor calibration issue, she explained hurriedly, both to Mrs. Chen and apparently to her superior. Everything is completely under control. As if to contradict her, the rice cooker chose that moment to emit a small cloud of sparkles and what sounded suspiciously like the first few bars of a popular K-pop song. Perhaps, Mrs. Chen suggested gently, we should focus on returning everything to its original state? Lynn's shoulders slumped slightly. I suppose you're right. Though I really thought the self-cleaning function I added to your vacuum cleaner would be helpful. It developed quite an enthusiastic personality during the upgrade process. As if on cue, the vacuum cleaner rolled out from under the bed, bumping affectionately against Mrs. Chen's leg like a pet seeking attention. She could have sworn it made a sad little beeping sound when Lynn began reversing the modifications. The process of de-upgrading the appliances took most of the morning. Mrs. Chen sat on Lynn's bed, watching in fascination as each device was gently returned to its original state. The toaster seemed particularly reluctant to give up its new capabilities, requiring several attempts before it stopped trying to connect to the Wi-Fi network. I just wanted to make your life more efficient, Lynn explained as she worked, her voice tinged with disappointment. Humans spend so much time on repetitive tasks that could be easily automated with just a few quantum mechanical adjustments. Mrs. Chen smiled softly. Sometimes the inefficiency is part of the experience, Lynn. Remember what we learned about potato chips? Lynn nodded thoughtfully. That not everything needs to be optimized for maximum efficiency to have value. Exactly. Besides, Mrs. Chen added, watching the vacuum cleaner make one last circuit of the room before Lynn began its demodification, I think some of our technology might not be ready for that level of advancement. Did you notice how the coffee maker started trying to predict my beverage preferences? Yes, it was developing quite a sophisticated algorithm based on your daily routine and biorhythms. Lynn paused. Though I suppose its attempt to automatically adjust your caffeine intake based on your sleep patterns might have been a bit intrusive. As the last device was returned to normal, Lynn's room slowly settled back into its usual orderly state. The only evidence of the morning's excitement was a slight sparkle in the air and the vacuum cleaner's newfound tendency to head toward Lynn's room whenever it was turned on. I did leave one small upgrade in your phone, Lynn admitted sheepishly. Nothing major, it just has slightly better battery life now. And maybe a tiny subroutine that ensures you always have perfect signal strength. Oh, and it might occasionally pick up broadcasts from passing satellites, but I'm sure you won't even notice. Mrs. Chen picked up her phone, which now felt somehow warmer in her hand, like a content cat. As long as it doesn't try to make contact with distant galaxies, I suppose that's acceptable. Actually, about that. Lin began, but quickly changed course at Mrs. Chen's raised eyebrow. Never mind. Would you like some coffee? I promise the coffee maker will behave entirely within normal parameters now. Though it might remember your preferred brewing temperature, I couldn't quite convince it to forget that particular upgrade. As they headed to the kitchen, Mrs. Chen couldn't help but wonder what other surprises her alien tenant had in store. At least life would never be boring, though she made a mental note to keep a closer eye on the toaster, which still seemed to be humming quietly to itself. The local spring festival was in full swing, and Mrs. Chen had decided it was time for Lin to experience one of humanity's most cherished traditions, a community celebration. She hadn't expected it to turn into quite such an adventure. There are so many humans gathered in one location. Lin whispered excitedly as they walked through the festival entrance. Her eyes darted everywhere, taking in the colorful lanterns, food stalls, and crowds of people enjoying the festivities. And they're all voluntarily participating in simultaneous recreational activities? The collective energy output must be enormous. Just remember, Mrs. Chen murmured, no scanning anyone, no taking readings, and try to look like you're having fun, naturally. Lin immediately adopted what she probably thought was a casual stance, though she looked more like a mannequin trying to imitate a fashion model. I have studied human expressions of enjoyment extensively. Observe my natural smile. Her attempt at a casual smile made a passing child burst into tears. Perhaps a little less intense, Mrs. Chen suggested gently. Their first stop was the food section, where Lin's fascination with human cuisine reached new heights. She stood transfixed before a cotton candy vendor, watching the pink fluff materialize from spinning sugar. You transform granulated sucrose into an edible architectural structure using centrifugal force and aerial expansion? Lin's voice rose with excitement. And humans consume this purely for pleasure? Despite its complete lack of nutritional value and highly inefficient volume-to-mass ratio? The vendor stared at her. It's $3. Mrs. Chen quickly paid for the cotton candy and handed it to Lin, who proceeded to analyze it from every angle. The structural integrity is remarkable considering its composition is primarily air and sugar filaments. But how does one consume such a thing without disrupting its entire molecular arrangement? You just eat it, Mrs. Chen demonstrated, tearing off a piece. Lin's first taste of cotton candy was a moment Mrs. Chen wished she'd recorded. Her alien tenant's eyes widened to nearly twice their normal size, her human disguise flickering just enough to give her skin a slight metallic sheen. It disappears. Lin gasped. The structure completely collapses upon contact with the oral cavity. This is the most fascinating example of temporary molecular gastronomy I've ever encountered. She paused, looking thoughtful. Though it does raise questions about human dietary priorities. You create food that serves no purpose other than to provide a momentary sensory experience and brief dopamine response? Sometimes that's purpose enough, Mrs. Chen replied, steering Lin toward the game stalls before she could start scanning the cotton candy's molecular structure in public. The carnival games proved to be another source of bewilderment for Lin. She spent 10 minutes analyzing the physics of the ring toss before declaring it deliberately designed to exploit common human perceptual errors. The rings are precisely sized to create an optical illusion regarding their diameter relative to the target bottles, she explained to a growing crowd of onlookers. Additionally, the slight asymmetry in the ring's weight distribution makes it aerodynamically unstable unless thrown with exactly the right force and rotation. Who wants to try their luck? The game operator called out quickly, trying to distract from Lin's detailed analysis of his game's design flaws. Luck is merely an expression of statistical probability influenced by various environmental and mechanical factors, Lin declared, stepping forward. I will demonstrate. What followed was either the most impressive or most suspicious display of ring toss mastery the festival had ever seen. Lin landed ring after ring with robotic precision, her throws so perfect they looked almost automated, which, Mrs. Chen realized with growing alarm, they probably were. "Perhaps we should try something else," she suggested, noticing the game operator's increasingly suspicious expression. But Lin was already moving on to the balloon dart game, her eyes glowing with the thrill of analysis. Another example of manipulated physics. The balloons are slightly underinflated to increase their resistance to puncture, while the darts are deliberately weighted to. Mrs. Chen managed to pull her away before she could complete her critique of carnival game design theory. The real excitement began when they reached the traditional dance performance area. The dancers were performing a beautiful fan dance, their movements graceful and synchronized. Lin watched in fascination, her head tilting at increasingly concerning angles as she studied the choreography. "The precision of their collective movement patterns is remarkable," she whispered to Mrs. Chen. "Though I believe I could help optimize their kinetic efficiency." Lin, no. Just a small anti-gravitational assist. Lin. But it was too late. A subtle purple glow had already begun to emanate from Lin's hands, and suddenly the dancers found themselves moving with unexpectedly enhanced grace, about 6 inches off the ground. The crowd gasped in amazement, assuming it was part of the show. The dancers, to their credit, maintained their professional composure despite their sudden levitation, incorporating their newfound weightlessness into their performance with impressive adaptability. "See? Much more efficient." Lin beamed proudly. Mrs. Chen closed her eyes and counted to 10. When she opened them, the dancers were thankfully back on the ground, though their fans seemed to have retained a slight tendency to float. As the evening wore on, they encountered more festival attractions that tested Lin's ability to blend in. The fortune teller's booth particularly confused her. But how can she access probability matrices without proper quantum scanning equipment? Lin wondered aloud, watching the fortune teller read someone's palm. The lantern release ceremony nearly caused another incident when Lin got overexcited and accidentally enhanced the lantern's luminescence, making them shine with an otherworldly purple glow. Fortunately, most people assumed it was just a special effect. It wasn't until they reached the fireworks display that Mrs. Chen realized how deeply the evening had affected her alien tenant. As the first rockets exploded overhead in a shower of sparks, she noticed Lin had stopped taking notes. Instead, she was simply watching, her expression one of pure wonder. "It's so beautiful," Lin whispered, her voice lacking its usual analytical tone. "They create such ephemeral art, knowing it will last only moments, and that's what makes it special." Mrs. Chen smiled. Beginning to understand why not everything needs to be efficient. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 days, turning the city into a watercolor painting of gray skies and glistening streets. Mrs. Chen was going through old photo albums when she heard a peculiar sound from Lin's room, something between a hum and a musical note that definitely wasn't of earthly origin. "Lin?" She knocked gently on the door. "Is everything all right?" As Mrs. Chen shared the stories behind each photograph, Lin's analytical facade began to fade. She listened with rapt attention to tales of first dates and family celebrations, of small triumphs and quiet moments of joy. The rain continued its gentle percussion outside, providing a soothing backdrop to their conversation. "This technology is so primitive," Lin marveled, touching a photograph gently. "Just flat images without any dimensional data or sensory recording. And yet, they contain so much more than mere visual information." "How so?" "Well, look at this one." Lin pointed to a photo of a much younger Mrs. Chen holding a baby. "The image quality is suboptimal, the lighting is inconsistent, and the composition doesn't follow any logical pattern. But when you look at it, your neural patterns show distinct emotional responses. The photograph somehow captures something that can't be measured or quantified." Mrs. Chen nodded. "That's my daughter, taken the day she came home from the hospital. She lives in Australia now, with her own family." "You miss her?" It wasn't a question. Lynn's voice had taken on a new quality, softer and more understanding. Even though you can communicate through various technological means, her physical absence creates an emotional response similar to what I'm experiencing regarding my home world. Yes, exactly. Lynn was quiet for a moment, processing this. The raindrops around them began to move in new patterns, forming shapes that looked almost like distant stars. Mrs. Chen, she said finally, I believe I've made an important discovery about humans. Oh? Your species has developed an extraordinary capacity to form emotional connections that transcend physical proximity and temporal limitations. These photographs, for instance, they're not just records of past events. They're anchors for emotional experiences, portals to memories that exist beyond simple data storage. As if to emphasize her point, Lynn waved her hand, and the floating raindrops arranged themselves into a three-dimensional recreation of one of the photographs, a scene from Mrs. Chen's garden party decades ago. On my world, we record everything with perfect accuracy. Every detail, every molecular interaction, preserved in quantum storage systems. But we don't have anything like this. She gestured to the photo album. These imperfect captures of moments that somehow contain more truth than the most detailed scientific documentation. Thunder rumbled again, closer now, and Lynn's raindrop recreation shimmered and shifted, forming new patterns. Would you like to try something? Mrs. Chen asked, reaching for her phone. We could take a picture together. Create a new memory. Lynn's eyes lit up, quite literally this time. But my human disguise, in photographs, has been flickering for the past hour, Mrs. Chen finished with a smile. And I haven't said a word about it, have I? Lynn looked down at her hands, which had taken on a subtle iridescent quality in the dim light. You truly don't mind? Lynn, you've been floating raindrops around my spare room while we look at old photos. I think we're well past pretending you're a normal tenant. The laugh that escaped Lynn was surprisingly human, warm and genuine. She moved closer to Mrs. Chen, and the floating raindrops arranged themselves into a glittering backdrop. Wait, Lynn said just before Mrs. Chen took the picture. She closed her eyes in concentration, and suddenly the raindrops began to glow with a soft purple light, creating an effect that looked like stars scattered behind them. There. Now it's a proper representation of both our worlds. The resulting photograph was unlike any other in Mrs. Chen's album, an elderly Chinese woman and her alien tenant, surrounded by glowing droplets of water that looked like a galaxy of tiny stars, both of them smiling genuine smiles that needed no scientific analysis to understand. I think, Lynn said later, as they sat drinking tea and listening to the rain, I finally understand why humans say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Though I would argue the actual data conversion ratio would be significantly higher, especially considering the emotional content encoded in. Mrs. Chen just smiled and poured more tea, letting her alien tenant work through her latest revelation about human nature. Outside, the rain continued its gentle rhythm, and the photograph they'd taken sat on the table between them, a perfect capture of an imperfect moment, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary things in life don't need to be explained or understood, just experienced and cherished. The message arrived on a quiet Sunday afternoon, appearing as a series of shimmering symbols in the air above Lynn's quantum communication device. Mrs. Chen, who had just brought in a plate of freshly baked cookies, knew immediately something was different. Lynn's usual excited chatter about human baking practices was replaced by an uncharacteristic silence. Is everything all right? Mrs. Chen asked, setting down the cookies that were still warm from the oven. Lynn's human disguise flickered more than usual as she read the floating message. My research period on Earth is coming to an end. The council has reviewed my reports and, they want me to return home in 3 days. The room felt suddenly still, save for the gentle hum of the quantum device and the faint whir of the vacuum cleaner that still had a habit of following Lynn around despite having its upgrades removed months ago. 3 days? Mrs. Chen sat down slowly. That's very sudden. Actually, Lynn admitted, her voice carrying an unusual tremor, I received the first notice 2 weeks ago. I should have mentioned it, but I found myself experiencing an unexpected reluctance to discuss the topic. I believe I was exhibiting what humans call avoidance behavior. Mrs. Chen smiled softly. We also call that not wanting to say goodbye. Goodbye. Lynn tested the word as if analyzing its molecular structure. Such a simple word for such a complex emotional experience. She looked around the room, at the small signs of her presence that had accumulated over the months, the notebook filled with observations about human behavior, the collection of inefficient but fascinating human snack foods she'd grown fond of, the slightly enhanced radio that occasionally picked up signals from passing satellites. I've learned so much here, Lynn continued, her scientific detachment failing to mask the emotion in her voice. About humans, yes, but also about everything else. Things that can't be measured or quantified. Things my species never considered important until. She trailed off as the vacuum cleaner bumped gently against her leg, making a sound that could only be described as sad. Until you started experiencing them yourself? Mrs. Chen suggested. Exactly. Lynn picked up one of the cookies, examining it with the same wonder she'd shown on her first day. Did you know that on my world, we don't have anything like these? We have perfectly calibrated nutrient delivery systems, but nothing that's made simply because it brings joy. Nothing that carries the imprint of care and time and. She paused, smiling slightly, what you call love. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. Lynn insisted on documenting everything one last time, the way sunlight created patterns on the kitchen floor, the sound of rain on the roof, the feeling of wind on her face. She took special interest in recording what she called non-quantifiable human experiences. The way the corners of your eyes crinkle when you smile genuinely rather than out of social obligation, she noted, watching Mrs. Chen laugh at her detailed analysis of human facial expressions. The subtle variations in the aroma of your morning tea depending on your mood. The statistically impossible way you always know when someone needs comfort even before they express distress. On her last evening on Earth, Lynn did something unexpected. She asked Mrs. Chen to teach her how to make dumplings. But you've recorded the process multiple times, Mrs. Chen pointed out, even as she began gathering ingredients. I don't want to record it this time, Lynn said quietly. I just want to experience it. The way humans do. And so they spent their last evening together in the kitchen, making dumplings the way Mrs. Chen had learned from her grandmother decades ago. Lynn's usually precise movements were clumsy at first, her attempts at pleating the wrappers resulting in oddly shaped creations that would have horrified her earlier, efficiency-obsessed self. They're perfectly imperfect, Mrs. Chen assured her, watching Lynn struggle with a particularly rebellious dumpling. Like all the best things in life. As they worked, Lynn shared stories about her world, tales of crystal cities that sang in stellar winds, of gardens where gravity was optional, of libraries that existed in quantum space. But she also spoke of what her world lacked, the spontaneous joy of a shared meal, the comfort of a warm cookie on a rainy day, the simple pleasure of making something with your own hands, even if it wasn't perfect. My final report to the council, Lynn confided as they sat down to enjoy their slightly misshapen but delicious dumplings, isn't what they expected. Instead of a detailed analysis of human inefficiencies and technological limitations, I wrote about resilience. About creativity. About how humans have turned their limitations into strengths, their imperfections into art. And what did they think of that? They're still processing it. Lynn smiled, a genuine human expression she'd learned not from studying facial muscle movements but from experiencing real joy. I included a section about how humans use cooking as a way to share love. They're particularly puzzled by that concept. The morning of Lynn's departure arrived too soon. As they stood in the garden where her transport would arrive, Mrs. Chen handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. What is this? Lynn asked, carefully opening it to reveal a photo album. "Memories," Mrs. Chen said simply. "Some things even your quantum storage can't capture." Lin flipped through the pages, finding photographs of all their adventures together, the shopping trip where she discovered the wonder of potato chips, the mahjong afternoon with Mrs. Chen's friends, the festival with its magical cotton candy, the rainy day with the floating water droplets, and countless small moments in between. The final page held the photograph they'd taken together, surrounded by glowing raindrops like stars. "Mrs. Chen," Lin's voice wavered as her human disguise flickered, revealing glimpses of her true iridescent form. "I believe I'm experiencing multiple emotional responses simultaneously. It's quite overwhelming." "We call that being human," Mrs. Chen said softly. Before Lin could respond, the air began to shimmer with the arrival of her transport. But instead of the efficient departure she'd planned, Lin did something entirely unscientific. She hugged Mrs. Chen tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for teaching me that the most valuable data can't be collected in a spreadsheet." As Lin prepared to leave, she turned back one last time. "You know, my species prides itself on understanding the universe, but we've missed something fundamental that humans grasped long ago." "What's that?" "What's that?" "That the most beautiful things in existence aren't perfect, predictable, or efficient. They're messy and complex and wonderfully flawed, like handmade dumplings, or rainy days, or—" She smiled, her eyes glowing purple one last time, like friendship. With that, Lin stepped into the shimmering transport field. But just before she disappeared, she pulled out one of Mrs. Chen's cookies she'd saved and took a bite, breaking every protocol about consuming earth substances during transport. The garden fell quiet after she left, though Mrs. Chen could have sworn the vacuum cleaner spent the rest of the day making melancholy circles around Lin's empty room. Life gradually returned to normal, or as normal as life could be after hosting an alien researcher. But sometimes, on quiet evenings when the rain falls just right, Mrs. Chen swears she can see tiny droplets of water floating in the air, glowing with a faint purple light. And occasionally, her appliances still hum unusual melodies when no one else is around. As for Lin's final report to her superiors, Mrs. Chen likes to imagine it ended with a simple but profound observation: humans may be inefficient, illogical, and limited by their biology, but they understand something we're only beginning to learn, that life's greatest mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only experienced. And sometimes, the most valuable discoveries aren't found in scientific analysis, but in a cup of tea shared with a friend, in a perfectly imperfect dumpling, or in the simple magic of a cookie fresh from the oven.